Good morning. My name is Amela Ajanovic. I'm working at Vienna University of Technology in Energy Economies Group, and in my presentation today I will talk about the impact of COVID-19 on the transport system. In my presentation I will start with brief introduction, then I will discuss recent developments and challenges that we have in the transport sector. I will talk about car-oriented mobility as well as urbanization. I will discuss the impact of coronavirus on mobility, what can we see already now, as well as what could be trends for the future. And finally, I will close my presentation with the major conclusions. For the long time of history, our transport system was based on non-commercial renewable energy sources. We have used horsepower sailing ships. With the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, with the new inventions such as steam machine, steam railway, electricity combustion engine, we have moved from renewable energy sources toward fossil energy. And in the scope of about 100 years, we have had very fast increase in service demand. This rapid development is not without consequences. What we can notice nowadays is that we have congestions, we have increasing local air pollution, global greenhouse gas emissions, very high noise level in cities, and this is something what have to be changed in the future. The fact is that our transport system is currently almost completely based on oil products. It is the least diversified energy sector with a huge energy dependency, especially from the Middle East countries. Using fossil energy for mobility results in rapidly increasing greenhouse gas emissions. In this figure you can see development of greenhouse gas emissions by sector in EU28. Over the last 2 decades we can notice in the most of the energy sectors stable, even decreasing greenhouse gas emissions. Only exception is the transport sector. In transport sector, emissions have been continuously increasing until 2007. After that, we can see slight decrease, mostly due to the economic crisis, but in the last few years we can notice again increasing trend. In the EU28, transport is responsible for about 1/4 of the total greenhouse gas emissions. Largest amount of these emissions are coming from the road transport, about 73%, and for these emissions in the transport sector, major contributors are passenger cars with a share of 61%. So it's very important to find a way to reduce emissions from the car passenger transport. In Europe, we have already broad portfolio of policies implemented, as well as we have pretty ambitious target for the future. So we have targets for the CO2 emission from the new passenger cars. The next target, which is to reach in 2021, is 95 grams CO2 per kilometer driven. For the next years, 2025 and 2030, we have already set even more ambitious target. To reach this target, it's important to improve energy efficiency of conventional cars, but also to increase the use of alternative automotive technologies which have higher energy efficiency. Then we have climate and energy package for 2020 and 2030, and according to these packages the goal is to have further reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, to have increasing use of renewable energy sources in electricity generation, as well as to have increasing energy efficiency. But in addition to this, the goal is is to have higher share of renewable energy in transport sector, 10% in 2020 and 14% by 2030. According to the Transport White Paper, the goal is to have further reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in 2030 as well as 2050, and in addition it's important to remove internal combustion engine vehicles from urban areas. By 2050 we should have urban areas completely without conventional cars. All these policy measures support also indirectly use of so-called zero-emission vehicles such as battery electric vehicles. And currently many countries have already announced ban of internal combustion engine vehicles as well as make decision to increase the use of zero-emission vehicles. For example, Norway will stop sales of internal combustion engine vehicles starting from 2025, and for example in Denmark, Ireland, Iceland, Israel, Netherlands and Slovenia this ban will start in 2030. Also in the scope of the Paris Declaration on Electric Mobility and Climate Change, electric vehicles have been seen as a technology which can help us to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions, and we have a goal to have more than 100 million and about 400 million two and three wheelers by 2030. And this is an ambitious target when we know that currently we have just about 7 million vehicles all over the world. The number of electric vehicles is rapidly increasing since 2010. However, the total number is still very low when we are looking at the total vehicle number. The largest number of electric vehicles currently is China, about 45%, followed by Europe, 24%, and United States, 22%. Electric vehicles, as every technology, have some advantages and disadvantages. The most important advantages of electric vehicles is high energy efficiency, much higher in comparison to conventional cars. Conventional cars have very low energy efficiency, about 25%. Then electric vehicles can help us to increase energy supply security. We can reduce dependency from oil imports. Electricity can be produced in every country using different primary energy sources. Then electric vehicles have zero emissions at the point of use, so they can help us to reduce local air pollutions, as well as in combination with electricity from renewable energy sources, they can contribute to the reduction of global greenhouse gas emissions. And electric vehicles can also help us to reduce the noise level, what is especially important for urban areas. However, besides these advantages, electric vehicles have also some disadvantages. The most important disadvantages are the cost. The price of electric vehicles is still significantly higher in comparison to conventional cars. Then electric vehicles have a shorter driving range in comparison to conventional cars. Then charging time is much longer. It could be between few minutes as well as few hours. And the charging infrastructure is mostly available in urban areas. Limited driving range of electric vehicles is often seen as a problem, but the fact is that the daily need for mobility in the most of the urban areas is between 10 and 40 kilometers per day, and this daily need can be covered with all types of electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are of special interest for urban areas. They can help us to reduce local air pollution as well as to reduce noise level. What we can notice over the last decades is that we have continuously increasing urbanization. More and more people is living in urban areas, and it is becoming challenging to provide mobility as well as other energy services to this growing population. By the end of 2050, we can count that just 1/3 of population will be living in rural areas. The major problem of the most of the urban areas is that we have car-oriented mobility. The number of vehicles is continuously increasing all over the world, and this leads to congestion. To avoid congestions, we are investing in new roads, and in the short term this could be a solution, but in the long term more roads means more cars, and more cars means more congestion, and more congestion means more roads, and we have a cycle. As a result of such cycle, we have a huge roads with a lot of powerful cars, but the average speed is about 20 km per hour. And this is something would have to be avoided in the future. It is also important to recognize that in urban areas we have very limited space that can be used for mobility, and there is a huge difference between areas that we need for private cars, bicycles, or public transport. To cope with some of the problems that we currently have in the transport sector, as well as to go towards more sustainable mobility, it is important to implement a weight shift improve strategy. Avoid means that we need to avoid all unnecessary travel and reduce trip distances, and this is very connected to the urban and spatial planning. It is also very important to have possibility to shift from private cars towards more sustainable transport modes, to have possibilities for safe walking and cycling, as well as to have affordable public transport. And also it is important to improve transport practices, to have possibilities for example, car sharing, as well as to improve efficiency of the technologies that we are currently using. To see the impact of implemented policies and measures, usually we are creating different scenarios, and business as usual scenario, as well as different kind of policy scenarios. However, in all of the scenarios that we currently have, we didn't calculated with the impact of coronavirus. The emergency of COVID-19 was first identified in December 2019 and declared a global pandemic on 11 March 2020. Already by the end of April, the World Health Organization reported 3 million COVID cases and over 200,000 deaths, affecting almost 200 countries. About 55% of the global population, representing almost 60% of global GDP, was subject to complete or partial lockdown at the end of April, and almost all global population was affected at least in some way. To slow the spread of the virus, governments across the world have imposed restrictions on most social and economic activities, and this pandemic has triggered a macroeconomic shock. The stop in the economic activity due to the lockdown has a huge impact on GDP. The total impact on annual GDP will be very dependent on the duration of the lockdown as well as on the shape of the recovery. The shape of the recovery can be affected by a possible second wave of the pandemic, but it is also dependent on the size and design of macroeconomic policy responses. In the best case, some economic activities affected by lockdown will be only postponed. However, in some sectors like tourism, the crisis may have a long-term impact. Actually, looking at this figure, we can see that every crisis has had impact on GDP. For example, Second World War or financial crisis. But in the most cases, activities have returned to the pre-crisis growth path relatively fast. However, the full impact of this crisis is still unknown. In this figure you can see a connection between new passenger car registrations and GDP. Due to the financial crisis, we have had significant decrease of annual GDP in period 2007-2009. But in the same time, we can see also significant reduction in the registration of new passenger cars. It was necessary about 10 years to come on the same level with the registration of new cars at the same level that we have had before the financial crisis. The latest data show that the drastic decrease of global economic activity and mobility during the first quarter of this year have reduced global energy demand for about 3.8% in relation to the first quarter of last year. If lockdowns last for many months and recoveries are slow in most of the countries, what is likely, according to the National Energy Agency, annual energy demand could drop by 6% in 2020. And as such decline has not been seen for the past 70 years. However, in the case of second wave of infections, this drop could be even higher. Coronavirus has affected almost every areas of our life, but especially mobility and our freedom to move from one point to another. We can already now recognize some key changes as well as possible trends for the future. There is a huge impact of coronavirus on auto industry, especially on new technologies such as electric vehicles. We can notice change in modal split, especially shift from public transport and sharing transport toward private cars as well as walking and cycling. We can notice a new working and living habits, for example, homework, video conferences, e-commerce, it's all increasing. And we can also see some short-term environmental benefits. We have lower emission and pollution level. The global car market is very sensitive to macroeconomic conditions. With the first outspread of the coronavirus in Asia, auto sales declined significantly, as you can see in this figure, especially in China and Korea, two countries mostly affected by virus. In Europe, automotive sales are forecasted to drop by 14% in this year, comparing to the last year. Just for comparison, it's important to know that during the financial crisis, the drop in vehicle sale was just 8%. In this figure, you can see the passenger car registrations in Europe. From January to May 2020, demand for new passenger cars dropped by about 41.5%. This decrease is different from country to country. The highest was in Spain, Italy, and France. Due to increasing unemployment, these decreases could lead to significant reduction of new cars on the road in the next 5 years. This will cause dramatic losses of revenues for auto industry dealers and suppliers, but also will increase the average age of vehicles. Especially electric vehicles could be affected by this crisis, at least in the short term. The major reason is that electric vehicles are economically less attractive than petrol and diesel cars, mainly due to higher investment costs. Until now, major driving force behind electric vehicle acceptance was need for more sustainable development of mobility. To increase electric vehicle adoption, many governments have provided different policies and measures to make electric vehicles more attractive and competitive with conventional internal combustion engine vehicles. However, currently very low oil prices make competition with conventional cars very hard. Cheap oil prices extend significantly the payback time of the price premium for electric vehicles. And in the current relatively poor economic situation, it is very likely that subsidies from the public will be at least limited in the future. In current situation, consumers may more hesitate to adopt new and expensive technologies such as electric vehicles. And already now it's evident that coronavirus has caused dramatic impact on the electric vehicle markets. For example, in China, electric vehicle sales dropped by 19% in February this year. China is not just the largest electric vehicle market, China is also leader in battery manufacturing. China is the major lithium-ion producer, and every delay in battery production in China have impact on electric vehicle production also outside of China. In the future, this globalized electric vehicle supply chain should be reconsidered and maybe changed towards shorter and more localized energy supply chains, which could help us to reduce the risk of disruptions as well as currency fluctuations, and could also reduce total carbon footprint. Many studies have showed that electric vehicles are suitable for everyday use in urban areas as well as for the car sharing. However, due to the possibility of infection spread, currently any type of sharing is pretty unattractive. Moreover, due to the limited travel possibilities with public transport, especially airplanes, cars should be able to cover also long travel distances. Since electric vehicles have shorter driving range and longer charging time, diesel and gasoline cars could be more preferable choice in this situation. However, the full impact of coronavirus on electric vehicles remains to be seen. For majority of consumers, travel time and comfort of mobility have had a high priority. However, with this virus, these preferences could be changed. Consumers are already showing an increasing care about health, meaning that safety is likely to become more important factor for consumers when deciding if, how, and when to move from one point to another. In this figure, you can see the lesson learned from China. What we can recognize is significant shift from public transport towards private cars. Many consumers have seen private cars, private transport as a way to reduce the risk of infections. Due to the risk of infections, also shared mobility, also micro-mobility, is currently less attractive. But in the same time, the sales of personal micro-mobility is growing as people prefer to use own devices to get around. Over the last years can be noticed increasing trend in cycling, and this can be supported by this crisis. As access to public transit system was limited, many cities have allowed bikers and pedestrians to use roads to cope with the social distancing. For example, Milan, one of Europe's most polluted cities and hardest hit by this pandemic, recently announced plans to permanently convert 35 kilometers of street to cycling and walking. Cycling is the best way to get around for many essential tasks. Walking and cycling are not only resilient, they are affordable and promote healthy lifestyle. I have already before discussed that the congestion is one of the major problems that we have in urban areas. Our road infrastructure is designed around two peaks, one in the morning and one in the evening. With travel reduction, we could reduce peak demand and supply and avoid investments in expensive new roads. We could also reduce the need for parking. This experience with lockdowns and coronavirus has showed that people whose work requires a computer and internet connection don't need to go to the office every day. Due to home working, a large number of cities are experiencing reduced or no congestion. For example, in this figure, you can see the traffic in Brussels in 1 week before this coronavirus last year in 2019 and 1 week in April 2020. What can be seen is that the total traffic is significantly reduced, and also it can be noticed that due to the home working we don't have these peaks in the morning and in the evening. This experience of home working is likely to accelerate trends toward more flexible working patterns and increased remote working even after the lockdown is lifted. This crisis has already significant impact on energy demand. Reduction in energy demand has also impact on emissions. During previous economic crises, the decrease in emissions was usually just in a short term, followed by a post-crisis rebound. For example, due to the financial crisis, global CO2 emissions decreased by 1.4% in 2009. However, already in 2010, there was an emission growth of 5.1%, what is well above the long-term average. Only crises driven by energy factors such as the oil crisis in the 1970s and 80s led to substantial shift in energy efficiency and the development of alternative energy sources. At present, it is still unclear how long and deep the crisis will be and how the recovery path will look like. The World Health Organization estimates that about 3 million people die each year from diseases caused by air pollution, and that more than 80% of people living in urban areas are exposed to air quality levels that exceed safe limits. Due to the stopped or reduced industrial activities and mobility, significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution could be noticed all around the world, and this can be seen as a benefit of this crisis. For example, during the late January and early February 2020, levels of nitrogen dioxide in Asia and Europe were lower by about 40% comparing to the same period of 2019. And most of these emissions comes from road transport and power plants, and they can cause respiratory illnesses. In this figure, you can see the density of nitrogen dioxide in China in January and February, before and after lockdown, and the difference is very clear. To reduce the concentration of nitrogen dioxide in urban areas, it's very important to replace conventional cars with electric vehicles. However, it's important to stress here that the full environmental benefits of electric vehicles we have only in combination with electricity produced from renewable energy sources. So on the one side, it's important to increase use of electric vehicles, but also to increase the share of renewable energy in electricity generation. This pandemic has showed us how the future may look like with less air pollution. So I'm coming to conclusions. This crisis is still ongoing, and we don't know what will be in the next period. We can count also with a second wave of infection. It is especially very high uncertainty regarding the long-term impact of COVID-19. However, already at this stage, we can recognize some significant changes, especially in the transport sector. Due to the risk of illness, as well as due to the mobility restriction that we still have, transport demand is significantly reduced. What we can also notice that we have changes in our lifestyle. We have increasing teleworking, so that demand for mobility is significantly reduced. We have reduced congestion in urban areas, what is a huge advantage. But reduced congestion means also that we have reduced money from the congestion charges, so that investment in roads or, for example, promotion of electric vehicles could be maybe lower in the next period. And let's say negative trend that we can notice currently is the shift from public transport toward the private cars. This private mobility is seen as a way to reduce the risk of infections. However, due to this crisis, we have also seen how nice it could be if we have more space for walking and cycling, and if we have much better air quality in cities. So this crisis should be also seen as a unique opportunity to rethink our transport system. Thank you for your attention.